Bonus episode time. But first, an exciting announcement. I'm speaking at this year's Intelligent Speech Conference and taking on the perilous topic of Gumbo. It's the 4th year of Intelligent Speech, and it will continue to be online, making it possible for all sorts of people from literally all over the world to get together over independent educational podcasts. This year will be on Saturday, June 25th. Tickets are $30 this year, but $20 if you purchase yours before May 15th. And if you use the promo code FOOD, there's an additional 10% discount. This and the link to the website will be in the show notes. Now, here we go. Episode 42.5. Bonus. How we got distillation, the water of life, and how booze came to America. Hello, and welcome to this bonus episode of the history of American food. This time, I'll be speculating about how someone even thought to do distillation, and then go into real history and real science that gets us up to how distillation worked through the end of the 17th century, how it helped, and how it killed people. So pull up to your place at the table, put on your safety goggles, and no eating in the lab, or you might turn into a dinosaur. The first thing that you need to know about distillation is that it is one of those things that definitely developed from people sitting around fires and staring at stuff cooking in pots with lids for a long time. And that its long association with wish fulfillment is heartily intact all these centuries later. I have no actual sources for the earliest development of distillation, but my gut tells me it was likely tied in with the use of fire in food preparation. What, you ask? Here's what's going on in my brain. One of the very first preservation techniques was smoking items to extend their shelf life. Something that was from the fire, but not of the fire, was slowing the rotting process. A second transformative fire-driven bit of food magic was stew. If you've ever taken something like a tough, gristly, unpromising hunk of beast, immersed it in water with mushrooms, garlic, maybe some mustard seeds, salt, and some spare roots or fruits, simmered it over a fire for hours, and then dug into a rich stew, swimming with tender meat bits, well, you might start to get ideas about the transformative powers of fire. I mean, sure, we snicker or sneer at the four humors of the world, proto-science that ran the medical profession and technology. But if you look at stew and smoked fish and flesh from that perspective, you've taken the fruits of the earth, meat, mushrooms, spices, and so on, bathed them in smoke or immersed them in water, and then placed them over a fire. You've seen air elements, the smoke or the steam, drift out, and you come up with something entirely new, different, and so much more durable or more delicious than when you started. From that orientation, the Four Humors framework was not a bad start on this science quest. It just needed work. Okay, a lot of work. But just as science does today, our understanding and explanations are getting better, but they are still a work in progress. Fire applied to earthy stuff was seen as transformative, while smoking meats is pretty straightforward transformation, drier and smoky smelling, but it's still recognizable as what it was. The fruits of the earth, immersed in liquids, and then set over fire, created entirely new things. For example, compare roasted garlic to raw. One is crunchy, pungent, and freshly bitten has a hot sensation on the tongue. But roasted, it's creamy, soft, and even sweet. How are these things the same thing? Anyway, if you're cooking something with a lid, you can see the droplets of something are collecting on it, but dripping back into the stew. What if? What if you could collect those droplets? Since they are the lightest, the airiest of the substances you are cooking over the fire, and they are striving to go to the heavens, there must be something special about them. And based on the earliest writings on distillation and its mysteries, this seems to have been the thoughts in the alchemists' heads, capturing and using the air element components that sought the heavens. The earliest recorded distillations had nothing to do with making booze. Instead, plant extracts were made, and more or less deadly chemicals. What we know as essential oils were extracted from plants, and other material with desirable scents, so lavender oil, peppermint, lemongrass, bergamot, and orange oils, along with many floral scents, much to the glee of perfume makers, were early products. Apothecaries or the early pharmacists used the scented stuff for their smells, but also for the way they affected our nerves. Mints produce a cool feeling, ginger and the later capsicums or chilies would produce hot feelings, and the wondrous clove brought numbness. Stones, jewels, pearls, strange goos like bitumen that oozed up from the earth were all distilled along with urine, blood, and many another substance that caught the interest of the medieval substance tinkerers. Many different methods of heating and separating these mixtures were developed. Tomes were written, legends were built, fortunes spent, and let's face it, more than one eye was put out with this frittering about. People, being people, then as now, came up with stories, systems, and explanations to work this new information into their worldview. And people then, as people now, they were not above looking at this new idea, this new technique, as the solution to all their problems and the way to answer all the questions, gain wealth, and live longer, possibly forever. Whether it's the internet, radiation, the vacuum pump, the printing press, or distillation, humans have a habit of deciding that the new baby technology holds the solutions to all society's ills and the answers to our wildest dreams. Moving out of the misty period of distillation prehistory, we get to actual, if vague, real history. The first hints of distillation are found in Mesopotamia. And for pointing me in the correct direction to dig at the foundations of distillation, all credit goes to Marwan al-Asmar, who can be found online as Milk Lions on Twitter and Medium, talking about alcohol in the Middle East. The Milk of Lions, incidentally, is a reference to the Lebanese anise-flavored, grape-based distilled spirit, arak. It has sisters that exist in many different forms all over the eastern end of the Mediterranean world. So distillation. It came to the notice of Europe through its adventures in the legendary city of Baghdad and its glorious golden age around the 7th century CE. But its roots lie farther back. Ancient Middle Eastern societies with elaborate burial practices seem to have done a sort of distilling to concentrate the essences of botanicals like roses, cedar, cypress, ginger, and myrrh in the first millennium BCE. A Mesopotamian king was famous for the sheer volume of balms, essences, and incense consumed by his court each and every month. Our old friend Dioscorides from the 1st century CE wrote about noticing droplets of mercury condensing on a pot lid he was boiling. This sort of speculation, incidentally, is what got me thinking about stew. Fast forward a bit, and the basics of distillation were agreed upon. Heat up liquid stuff or stuff in liquid, capture the escaping air spirits, and turn them back into liquid. The big problem of the age was predictable heating. In today's modern labs, a nice electric heat source with a digital thermostat and some fuzzy logic to keep the temp steady is at our fingertips. But back in the days of quill pens, wax seals, cabochons, and clay lamps, getting a steady heat out of a flame from a wood or dried dung fire was a challenge of the first order. For lots of reasons, changes in size, age, liquid content, sap pockets, wood has lots of reasons not to burn at a steady temperature. And the stoves and heating apparatuses lacked a lot of the things we take for granted, an ability to change the distance between the pot and the fire, or an easy-to-change aperture, not to mention a simple thermostat to simply change the size of the flame or current. So what was an early turn of the millennia budding distiller to do? Insulation. One early solution was to build beds of sand atop the surface that would be heated by the fire. This definitely damped down any variations in the flame and made a pretty easy way to adjust distance to the heat source. The sheer grittiness of this solution doesn't lend itself to modern applications, but another early solution does. The hot water bath, or the bain-marie. Because I first ran across this term in French cooking, desserts particularly, I'd always assumed it had some religious association, since many desserts are linked to a particular religious celebration. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that the bain-marie, or Mary's bath, is actually a reference to a female medieval alchemist known as Maria, or Mary the Jewess. None of her original works survive, but based on references to her writings in the works of other alchemists, such as Zosimus of Panopolis, an Hellenic Egyptian of the 3rd century CE, she is credited with the invention of the tribocos that looks like the parent of the pot and alembic stills that can still be found in use today. But more importantly, she apparently pioneered the water-filled vessel that is used to heat a vessel floating in it, prefiguring baking creme brulee in a water bath or melting chocolate and making 7-minute frosting in a double boiler. The sand insulation doesn't need to be replenished and is more stable, but will eventually get as hot as the fire underneath. The water bath had the advantage of having good visual cues that it was getting too hot, and it had a hard limit for how much heat it could transfer. Anything in the water would never get above the temperature of boiling water. Incidentally, that's why I could do the chemistry lab trick of holding a paper cup with water in it over a Bunsen burner, and the water would boil, but the cup would not burn up until all of the water had boiled away. It was a great way of visualizing heat capacity, the amount of energy it takes to alter the temperature of a thing, which is both a weird but very cool concept. The idea of distillation seems to have traveled out of Mesopotamia to the east and to the west. The uses and techniques would develop along 2 different paths over the next 14 or so centuries on either side of the Persian Empire and the dividing mountains, seas, and deserts of Central Asia. The sea travel and the general restlessness of the Middle Ages would start to knit alchemy and distillation back together. While Europe was a mess after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, distillation technology seems to have traveled up the Silk Road to Imperial China of the Eastern Han in about the 1st century CE and into the workshops of Taoist monks and alchemists. The history of making medicines and then later potions of immortality is long and complex and way outside my field. But there are mentions of distilling spirits at this point in early China, along with chemical distillations for magical and medical purposes, which sometimes had heavy overlap. The distillation of alcohol for recreational consumption apparently was developed and somewhat industrialized in China, and exported to its friends, enemies, and client states. As a result, strong liquors would play more and less havoc in diplomatic situations as people's used to lightly alcoholic beers and kumis, and then meads and wines, would come to grief in picturesque and legendary ways. It seems like distillation of ethanol for consumption was separately developed by the Islamic world around the 7th century CE before it would come to Europe in any great amounts. Because the idea of distillation, much more than the physical technology, is what mostly traveled up the Silk Road, the earliest Chinese-derived distillation apparatuses look nothing like the long attenuated tubes of copper and other metal Americans associate with distillation. Chinese-descended apparatuses tended to be pottery and wood contraptions rather than copper, and used large ceramic and earthenware condensers that use cold weather for a heat sink, rather than running water on the idealized metal ones. Anyway, back to our story and Western distillation so we can eventually get to America. Heat regulation schemes were worked out. Distillation container shapes and materials were worked out. The next question was how to condense the vapors. These airy spirits released from the starting substance could be captured in the top of the vessel, but how to return it to a usable form by the alchemists? Tubes. Tubes were the answer. The fanciest items were the work of the finest metal workers, making curls and spirals and columns of purified and flexible metals like copper, tin, lead, or gold. But gold was realistically too flexible and, let's face it, too precious. But lead and copper were much loved since they were less subject to corrosion. And copper was the favorite since it was also flexible, ductile, it made thin wire and sheets easily, was not too fragile, and had a low heat capacity. That is, it changed temperature with small energy investments. Some other properties of copper will come into play when we get into worrying about the flavor of the spirits in the 18th and 19th centuries. But by the 8th century CE, the Islamic world had refined the science of distilling to an impressive extent, especially since they were working in a world of wood, metal, leather, and stone. There was not a rubber gasket or plastic tube to be found. The most sophisticated and cosmopolitan cities, Baghdad especially, did have access to sources of running water and even ice. This was a big advantage when it came to condensing in an age before aquarium pumps. But alcohol was barely an item of interest. It might be extracted and used as a solvent for other items or as a curiosity, a possible contender for that quintessence, a liquid that burned, that easily returned to the air, and stopped the putrefaction of earthly things, vegetable and flesh. But in a land of pretty good wines, many herbal decoctions, sherbets, and soon coffee, as well as being a society that was working out the idea of not consuming confounding substances, distilled alcohol for ingestion was not a priority. To make things more interesting, the word alcohol, like alchemy, as well as a bunch of other al words like algebra, algorithm, alembic, alcove, not to mention other stuff like coffee, sofa, cotton, giraffe, apricot, zero, and as I mentioned back in the rum episode, julep, are all more or less laundered Arabic words hanging out in modern English. And so the original meaning of the word alcohol comes from the idea of a finished product of distillation. Now there's one thing that the word alcohol stuck to, like the word Kleenex stuck to the disposable paper tissue. And that was a black powder that was the result of purifying antimony and then reacting it with sulfur salts to make a soluble black powder used to outline eyes, or what we think of now as kohl, the KOHL. The antimony, incidentally, seems to offer some protection from eye infections and discourages insects. But coal was, and often is, made with lead sulfides, and that is bad, bad news. Oh, and a quick aside, the English word coal, C-O-A-L, is from a root that means ember. So while charcoal is used as a coal substitute, K-O-H-L, the words are not at all related. Anyway, so the purified end product of a distillation was called alcohol or alcohol, depending on regional pronunciation. So initial distillations of wine were called the alcohol or alcohol of wine. And as the process was applied to other products, alcohol became the generic term for the ethanol product. Distillation continued on as a companion to medicine, alchemy, and associated quacks and influenced scammers. There's an interesting side quest to be pursued on how the newness and poorly understood nature of distillation in Europe, along with the increased mobility that started to happen around the 13th century, created a fabulous and scam economy based on these nostrums and pills and prayers. As much as I like to point out the failings of the pilgrims, they did kind of have a point with being sick of charlatans and showmen showing up in their village with the newest cure for the plague, a sure prayer to get one into heaven, curses for your annoying neighbor's cows, and aphrodisiac beer groots. Some of the fragmentary and poorly translated texts they were being haunted with are still floating around the internet even today. I mean, it's not that hard to find someone who has, at last, figured out the meaning of the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. And now, for just the low price of, just never mind. Okay, the actual useful aspect of distillation that would come into the ken of the practical householders was taking fermented stuff from grains, roots, fruits, sap, honey, or even just fermented sugar water that, left to their own devices, would go quickly rotten or to vinegar. Now, they could be given a longer, nay, nearly indefinite life in the storehouse. It was this practical use that was spreading out from the center of the 8th century Arab world to Europe, to North Africa, to Western and Central Asia. In the early days, the spirit of wine continued to be a curiosity. And as with just about every new thing discovered by explorers, no matter their home base, be it European, Asian, African, or American, this new stuff was tried as a medicine. But unlike many other medical innovations, this one had a bit of merit. It was good at extracting and preserving. It could calm, relax, and even numb people. People the world over also noticed the relaxing effects of the distilled spirit combined with its indestructibility. And humans, as a group, we like a little social lubricant, whether it be hallucinogenic mushrooms, relaxing burning plant leaves, hot water extractions of leaves and seeds, so we were perfectly willing to take up this interesting liquid from the alchemist's workshop. And since distilled alcohol was now to be regularly used for human consumption, the important step of removing the poisonous bit at the start of the distillation became both widely known and a regular practice. So, distilled alcohol production really started to move. Slowly at first, due to practical mechanical constraints, but move it did, out of the alchemist's workshop and into the realm of the brewer and the baker. By the time we get to the early 17th century, distilled spirits from wine, grape, and all other fruits, from grain mashes, from palm sap, and possibly in Central Asia and Oceania, from sugarcane juice, they were being made in limited quantities. Decoctions containing seeds, leaves, roots, fruits, and saps, and occasionally pearls and precious metals were offered as medicines. They were very much a special occasion drink, imbibed by the wealthy and royal for celebration, commemoration, and for solemn diplomatic functions. And they were offered to the very ill as succor, or as a way to ease passing through the veil at the end of this mortal existence. The name aqua vita, first found in the 13th century writings of one Arnoldus Villeneuvis. This is the Latinization of one Arnaud Villeneuve, an alchemist working in Muslim Spain. This name fit in with all the other strong waters and oils that were emerging out of the distillation practices. There was also aqua fortis, which we know now as nitric acid, oil of vitriol, which we know as sulfuric acid, and aqua regia, a mix of hydrochloric acid and nitric acid, mainly noted for its ability to dissolve gold. So the term aqua vita fit right in with this way of seeing the world. Ramon Lull was the one who seems to have made the connection that alcohol was the spirit of wine, and thus stuck distilled alcoholic drink with the name spirits. By the way, that name, Lull, is spelled L-L-U-L-L. I had to get help with pronouncing that one. And so even now, these ideas of naming alcohol for drinking hang with us even today. We have aquavit, aquavit, eau de vie, whiskey, which is a laundering of the Gaelic for water of life, and Geist, which is German for ghost or spirit. And of course, vodka, or little water, because the Russians are regularly the most contrary people on the planet. By the 15th century, these strong waters, with their magic-adjacent names, were available for drinking. But at this point, almost all alcoholic drinks imbibed for nourishment, sociability, and relaxation were simply fermented. The beers and wines that are tied to a particular place and depended heavily on the agricultural cycle. Our 16th century sailing adventurers would have had some spirits on board, but they would have been treated as fairly precious. The daily drinks would have been water of better or worse quality, and beer also of variable potability. At this point, distillation was well known and understood, if time-consuming, and resource-greedy. A popular sentiment expressed in 1530 was, "Distilling is nothing other than the purifying the gross from the subtle, and the subtle from the gross, with the intent that the corruptible be made incorruptible, and the subtle spirit be made more subtle, so that it can better pierce the body, conveyed to the place most needful of health and comfort." It's helpful in understanding that whole sentiment that in the 16th century, gross simply meant coarse or common, not disgusting. And subtle had the connotation of being refined and elevated, even airy and released from the earth, which is why the fine constructions of sugar I talked about in episode 5, crafted by sugar bakers, were called subtleties. The 17th century colonists, washing up on the shores of North America, carried with them a supply of aqua vita. It was guarded closely and was used sparingly, or at least it was supposed to be. There was definitely some ruckus in Virginia, as the guys in charge seemed to be nipping at the community supply more than seemed acceptable. And these fiery liquors were also used in diplomatic interactions with the American tribes. Native Americans brought tobacco. The colonists matched by offering distilled alcohol, their water of life. I'll talk about the progression of that relationship in more detail starting next season. But by 1640, the Dutch had set up North America's first distillery in New Amsterdam and were making gin and probably some rum from molasses and brandy from fruit as well. For what it's worth, the first distillation apparatuses in all the Americas were set up by the Spanish to distill the agave beer or pulque into early mezcal and tequila. Another little interesting tidbit Milk of Lions set me upon was the probability that early tequila or mezcal likely saw some of the reuniting of the two styles of distillation, the metal Arabic Western style and the pottery and pit-based technology developed in China. Some friends of mine were on tours of some tequila distilleries, and I sent them with fieldwork questions. They were able to report that the official government-sponsored distilleries providing liquor for the government installations and the Catholic institutions were using metal equipment laboriously imported from Spain, though later on, stills would be manufactured in the extensive grounds of church compounds. But if there's one thing I've learned, distilled alcohol seems to breed moonshiners, those that want to work outside the official sanction. And it appears that a certain breed of Spanish and possibly Portuguese adventurers as well, that for any number of reasons didn't want to work under the official umbrella, still wanted their booze. And the Western style of distillation requires metal, which requires a whole bunch of tech that is likely to be noticed or controlled by officialdom. But a bunch of guys who were sailors and adventurers in New Spain, that is, South America, had made trips to Macau or to the Philippines or Indonesia, all places that were distilling in the Chinese style with pits and clay pots. And there are archaeological digs in the Spanish-occupied areas of South America that show evidence of Chinese-style distilling. It may not have been widespread, and it was likely not sanctioned by the government, but it looks like the distillation of pulque to make a mezcal or tequila may have been done using both kinds of distilling technology. But back to New York. When the English booted out the Dutch government and made it New York, they opened up more distilleries, which, due to continued difficulty of growing grain in the early years, tended to become rum distilleries. Also, by the time the English took over New York, rum and other aquavitas were becoming a larger part of ships' stores. And more sailors, English, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, French, and everyone else, were tasting more types of distilled drinks at portside bars along with the wines and ales. So there was more money to be made distilling alcohol, even if one did it badly. There was the literal underground distillation of pulque going on in South America, and there was definitely industrialized distillation going on in China of both wines and grain mashes, including their baijiu or shoju. And then there were the araks, made of a variety of things, and they were kind of everywhere else. In North America, outside of the more or less organized distilleries, people were doing bad distilling. Sickening, blinding, burning, and generally disabling themselves and others along the way. The most doomed to fail of these were people simply heating up fermented molasses mixtures and collecting the vapor in unprocessed shorn wool, and then drinking or selling the squeezins. This was so bad for so many reasons and likely did in a whole bunch of people. First of all, anytime you have a fermented brew, be it molasses or grain or fruit, the yeast and a few other single-cell buggies are making more than alcohol. There are a few other byproducts of their eating. These and other impurities called congeners can be pulled out of the initial solution into the first distilled vapor. The more distillations you perform on the same liquid, the more of these congeners you leave behind. It's heavier stuff, and you end up with a pure ethanol. This is part of that gross and subtle separation mentioned earlier, and also why distilled drinks, especially vodkas, will emphasize how many times they've been distilled. Now, the lightest congeners, the ones that vaporize first, tend to be the most toxic. Methanol, or the alcohol with only one carbon, is the most notorious, though there are others. But just to be clear, 10 milliliters, or about a third of an ounce of this methanol, it will blind people. It's able to particularly poison the optic nerve. Incidentally, because methanol is so small, it can be absorbed through the skin. Normally, this isn't a big issue, but during the early stages of the COVID-19 novel coronavirus outbreak, when everyone wanted hand sanitizer, some bootleg versions were being made with methanol, which, due to its ability to be absorbed through the skin, could and did cause problems. And a dose of 30 to 100 mils, or about 1 to 3 ounces, body weight dependent, of course, can be fatal if ingested. So what I'm trying to say is methanol is not something to mess about with. Anyway, by the 17th century, any educated distiller or alchemist knew that the first cut of a distillation of alcohols, ethanol specifically, must be discarded or set aside to, clean equipment or do away with rats. But the people boiling molasses beer for underhanded profit often didn't know or just didn't care. They would blind or otherwise permanently incapacitate themselves or their customers. And that's if they didn't just explode or burn themselves badly. See, at this point, all distillation was done using a flame. Again, professional distillers and surviving alchemists had closed fireboxes, decent ventilation. In fact, most distilling at scale was done either outdoors or under a roof on poles. And they all worked very hard to have a fire down here and contained, and then the alcohol vapors way up over there and trapped in a tube. Once again, these fireplace distillers collecting stuff in wool ran a higher than average risk of lighting themselves on fire by working in enclosed spaces with open flames and concentrated alcohol vapor. Which is all to say, yes, you can distill at home, but don't do it casually. And maybe in this day and age, when we have electric heat sources, maybe go with one of those. Oh, and don't drink the first part of a distillation. You'll likely die or hurt your innards in interesting and terrible ways, which is even worse than turning into a dinosaur. But reputable 17th century distillers knew this, and now you do too. By the 17th century, distilled liquors were starting to be an important part of the economy. They were expanding the money to be made from the sugar industry. They were introducing interesting new possibilities in the developing biological sciences and increasing food preservation options. The hot waters were changing how society partied, both high and low. Distilled spirits were developing into a new global currency. Like salt, it was immediately consumable, was infinitely divisible, and was useful everywhere, and didn't seem to go bad. In fact, unlike most wines or beers, it could get even better with long sitting. So innovations are coming for the distilling industry. But what I've covered is the past, bringing it right up to the cusp of widespread industrial distilling, which I will get to in Season 2 in the 18th century and beyond. Thanks for listening. Check out the show description for links to Intelligent Speech. It'd be fun to see people there on June 25th. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Even if you don't feel like writing a whole review, your star ratings on your favorite podcast widget make the show more findable. So please take a few seconds to express your thoughts in gold stars, and if you have time, leave a review. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description. If you're wondering what all my dinosaur references are about, go check out the soap bonus episode, but I'll put a link in this show description too.